Welcome to the Fantasy Zone, the real Fantasy Zone. It's Segaiden episode 31. The Mark III may have been redesigned to look slick and black and imposing for the US market, but you ultimately can't take the Sega out of the Sega game. The Master System's very first arcade shooter conversion for the US market is Fantasy Zone, the original Q-'em-up. Upbeat samba music, pastel colors, adorable character designs. This is the real Sega. And despite its cutesy looks, Fantasy Zone offers plenty of challenge and depth, making it every bit as legitimate a shooter as any to show up on Sega's Astro City Mini V. I mean, you can directly connect this game to XEVIOUS in 2 steps. Yes, that's right. We may be dealing with Sega's US lineup now rather than Japan-only early releases for Famicom, but you can already feel the weight of Namco's seminal shooter casting its gravity on this system. In a 2014 interview from STG Gameside magazine translated by, who else, Shmuplations, Sega arcade developer Yoji Ishii explained that he took inspiration for Fantasy Zone from Konami's GRADIUS. In fact, it wasn't so much a matter of taking inspiration as it was aspiring to surpass. Ishii wanted to make a shooter that could beat GRADIUS at its own game. And GRADIUS in turn came about from the desire to surpass XEVIOUS. So the Master System enters the console race trying to one-up the game that one-upped XEVIOUS. On the whole, it succeeds. Fantasy Zone plays almost like a combination of Defender and GRADIUS with maybe a little Bosconian in there. And also, it has a touch of role-playing game, as was the trend at the time. It represents a crown jewel in the non-Yu Suzuki strain of Sega's creative DNA. That is, it's a game emphasizing creativity rather than tech, with nary a scaling sprite to be seen. Only one thing connects it to Sega's Superscaler lineup, a great soundtrack by Hiroshi Kawaguchi. Unlike the fairly serious rock of Hang On or the breezy calypso city pop of Outrun, Fantasy Zone's music has a bright poppy quality that dabbles in samba rhythms. The shuffling tempo and upbeat tone might seem an odd fit for a high-intensity shooting game, but it fits Fantasy Zone. Perhaps the first ever attempt at creating what we now refer to as a cute-'em-up. It's like a shoot-'em-up, but cute. It doesn't take itself seriously. Fantasy Zone has a colorful, whimsical graphical style that underlies its fairly severe difficulty level. The backgrounds consist of strange alien backdrops that might seem imposing and bizarre if not for the fact that they're all rendered in friendly pastel shades of baby romper pink and robin's egg blue. Also, the enemies tend to look silly rather than intimidating, bearing cartoon faces and big saucer eyes. It's as though Sega saw hints of faces in the clouds in Super Mario Bros. And said, we can do better. And of course, the player's avatar, not a ship, but rather a ship-like being named Opa Opa, cements the whimsy. A colorful egg-shaped vessel with a pair of feet and fluttering angel wings, Opa Opa's rounded contours and bright primary color scheme make him the friendliest-looking shooter protagonist gaming had ever seen to this point. Opa Opa instantly became a company mascot, at least in Japan. Over here, Sega unfortunately leaned harder on the vastly less charismatic Alex Kidd. In addition to appearing in several Fantasy Zone sequels, Opa Opa also made countless in-game cameos and even served as the team mascot in the Zillion anime. It's not only Opa Opa's looks that help establish the tone of Fantasy Zone, but also his skills. At a basic level, he moves around the screen at a fairly measured pace compared to ships and many other shooters, and with good reason. Fantasy Zone doesn't play like your typical Gradius-style shooter with forced scrolling and one-way action. Instead, it draws from Williams' Defender, placing players in a sort of torus that scrolls infinitely in all directions. Yoji Ishii came about this design approach naturally, having previously directed FLICKY, which used a similar infinite loop setup. In this case, the game wears its Defender inspiration quite plainly. Besides being a horizontally scrolling shooter in which you need to destroy a set number of foes while swooping down to collect things, it even has a mini-map in the corner of the screen to help you chart your progress through a stage. Well, that's true of the arcade version anyway. The Master System port couldn't quite keep up with demands of the System 16A hardware that powered Fantasy Zone in arcades, so it loses some key features. Not only the radar map, but also the slight vertical scrolling that allows levels to extend beyond the top and bottom of the visible screen area. The Defender-like quality of the action accounts for Opa Opa's more deliberate speed and motion. In an auto-scrolling shooter like GRADIUS, most of your movement amounts to maneuvering around within a fixed space to dodge hazards and line up shots. In Fantasy Zone, your movement also defines the fixed space. This does tend to be Fantasy Zone's major weakness. Rather than sending fixed waves of enemies at you, the game spawns random groups of adversaries, something you can see even at the outset of a new game. Start and immediately end 3 or 4 games in rapid succession, and you'll likely see different enemy formations each time. As you move around, you cause the screen to scroll in the direction of your current facing. The game allows a fair amount of free movement in the center of the screen so that every action you take doesn't cause the screen to immediately hitch back in the opposite direction, which is a good design instinct, but it means that you need to fly fairly close to the edge of the screen in order to make it scroll. Thankfully, you don't have to hug the screen edge as aggressively as in, say, Iki, but the lion's share of deaths in Fantasy Zones do tend to come about as a result of the need to put yourself at the forward boundary of the screen without the ability to predict exactly which type of enemy is likely to spawn next or which direction they'll come from. This becomes troublesome in the third stage when enemies begin firing projectiles at you, behaving with reactive patterns that center on Opa-Opa's position. It's often safest to press against the forward edge of the screen and fire vigorously, allowing you to take out approaching foes the instant they spawn into view, except when the foes that appear fire back the instant they materialize. On the other hand, if you hang back and play more cautiously, enemies have a pretty good chance of boxing you in, and that presumes you even want to focus on the minor foes who don't even really matter in the grand scheme of things. You can blow up as many minor enemies as you like, but it won't get you anywhere. In order to advance from one stage to the next, you need to take out a number of fixed targets. Not quite bosses, not quite enemies, not quite bases. These targets fill the sky of each stage and hover motionless, disgorging an infinite array of small defenders. They seem reminiscent of GRADIUS enemy dispensers, except they have googly eyes. And once you destroy them all, a task that takes about a dozen standard shots or roughly half as many bombs, the stage fades to pitch you against a boss. In the arcade version, you needed to destroy 8 bases per stage. Here, you only have to take out 6, a change likely necessitated by the reduced hardware power available to this conversion. With the loss of the minimap, which tracked the relative location of bosses in the coin-op game, tracking down the remaining bases can take longer, which leaves you more vulnerable to the hazards of scrolling the screen forward. To keep the action more balanced, the Master System adaptation reduces the size of the stages and the number of bases you need to destroy. This doesn't make the action any easier, mind you. Again, starting at stage 3, the gloves come off, carrying forward the SG-1000 tradition of games easing you in before taking a sudden upward spike into Sega Hard. Despite the smaller levels, reduced per-stage targets, and downgraded audio and graphics, Fantasy Zone retains perhaps its biggest and most innovative feature for Master System, its economy. Here we find the game's most interesting iteration on the GRADIUS concept, the element that makes it more than simply a mashup of existing shooters. When you take out enemies, they drop coins. This is more or less standard video game design, of course. Destroy a bad guy, claim a prize. In GRADIUS, you collected capsules left behind by certain enemies, which fed into a power-up bar at the bottom of the screen. Once you had collected enough capsules to activate a specific power, such as bombs or options, you could activate them by spending your capsule, as it were, a primitive form of video game economy. Fantasy Zone simply makes this more literal. Rather than directly expending capsules as you gather enemy drops, you collect money that you can then spend at actual shops. In early 1986, when Fantasy Zone first debuted in arcades, this concept didn't really exist that much in action games. Role-playing games, sure, but those hadn't yet broken into the mainstream of gaming in Japan. That would happen later in the year, once Shonen Jump magazine convinced readers to check out their star artist's game project, Dragon Quest. I'm sure people will point out obscure exceptions to this rule in the comments, but even likely candidates, such as Namco's Dragon Buster and the Tower of Jiraga, didn't let you spend money in-game. Early computer-based action RPGs like Hydlide and Xanadu didn't have shops, and The Legend of Zelda had only been out for a month by the time Fantasy Zone debuted. In short, Fantasy Zone's shop feature broke new ground in arcade and console games. It allowed players to customize their loadouts based not on some linear system or whichever power-ups enemies happened to spawn, but rather giving players total control over their upgrades, assuming they could collect enough money. The arcade and console industries would both quickly swipe this idea. Within a year, you'd begin to see in-game economies in the likes of Westone's Wonder Boy and Monsterland, and Capcom's Black Tiger, and even in Dragon Slayer games. These would typically work along the same lines as this one. Defeat foes, collect cash, spend it at shops, become more powerful. In this case, the shops appear at specific times during each stage, is a red balloon that hovers on screen for a few seconds before vanishing. If you touch the balloon, you'll enter the shop, where you can use a simple menu select screen to purchase items. These items fall into 3 general categories: speed enhancements, shot upgrades, and bomb upgrades. Plus, you can buy extra lives, which are expensive but worth it considering the overall difficulty level. You can only equip 1 item per category at a time, though you don't have to use them all immediately. When you leave the shop, you can select your current loadout, saving some upgrades for later if you wish. These upgrades generally resemble the ones in GRADIUS, down to the fact that speed upgrades can actually make you too fast. Though certainly they have a style of their own. I mean, the laser and double bomb work like similar weapons from GRADIUS, but the 7-way shot seems more like something from Contra, which didn't exist yet, and the heavy bomb leans all the way into the game's cartoon aesthetic by dropping a massive 16-ton weight on foes straight out of Looney Tunes. The versatility of the upgrade system comes with a few drawbacks. For starters, your main weapon upgrades have a 20-second time limitation rather than becoming permanent additions until you die. This means you rarely have the opportunity to take gun upgrades into boss encounters. Even if you manage to luck into a weapons swap opportunity immediately before taking out the final stage base, the bosses take 10 or 15 seconds to materialize and produce active targets. Bombs, on the other hand, you can carry freely until you die, but all except the twin bomb option only give you a single bomb per purchase. And each time you buy any upgrade except the big wings, it becomes more expensive, which makes stockpiling weapon improvements impossible, and forces you to consider whether it makes more sense to invest and purchase immediately and ease your way into the later game at the risk of pricing yourself out of subsequent upgrades, or if you're better off clearing the first few levels with basic gear and kitting yourself out with cheap enhancements later. Whatever the case, the coin drop mechanic turns Fantasy Zone into more than just a basic shooter about combat and evasion. Harvesting cash plays a huge role in the game, and the need to swoop down to snatch coins, which obey gravity and bounce for a while after dropping, before they vanish shakes up the standard flow of the game. Sure, you can simply fly around and shoot bad guys, but you'll have a better time of it if you break away to grab money when it appears, especially the ultra-valuable coins that fall from defeated enemy bases. The shower of coins that explodes onto the screen when you beat a boss gives you a real sense of accomplishment. Sure, it always feels good to simply defeat the impressively difficult bosses, but snatching loot from the free-for-all chaos of the aftermath feels even better. The bosses take no prisoner, which neatly absolves any sense of guilt you might have for plundering their corpses. A lot of shooter bosses in this era like to operate on a timer that would cause them to leave the screen if you didn't defeat them in time. Fantasy Zone reverses this system from the likes of Alpha Mission. You have a limited window of time in which to destroy a boss, but if you take too long, they don't peace out. No, they decide to take matters into their own hands and advance toward you, eventually crushing you against the back edge of the screen. And yes, there is a back edge to the screen in boss battles. Once these encounters begin, Fantasy Zone locks you into a single screen and removes Oba Opa's ability to face left, the closest it ever comes to being a normal shoot-'em-up. I don't think Fantasy Zone is entirely perfect. The combination of scroll logic and enemy randomization can lead to some pretty unfair deaths, and the timer on the weapons upgrades, and the player's lack of agency over when to activate them, undermines the genre's thrill of progressive, permanent empowerment. The Master System version simplifies the structure of the action, and suffers from obvious visual and musical downgrades, too. But on the whole, it plays quite well for a mid-1986 release. Taken in the context of its contemporaries, Fantasy Zone reached the US several months before the NES port of GRADIUS, and frankly it looks nicer and features greater depth of gameplay. The impressive-looking Hang-On may have been the right call to include as Master System's pack-in, but for my money, Fantasy Zone was the console's true killer app. Nothing on Nintendo or Atari systems could compare to this in August 1986, and even years later, Fantasy Zone for Master System could stand toe-to-toe with NES greats like Section Z and Life Force. Certainly the NES's attempts to recreate Fantasy Zone didn't do much to impress. Sunsoft developed and published a rendition of the game for Famicom, and Tengen would publish an unlicensed version developed by Pixel in 1990. Neither held a candle to Sega's own version. More arcade-accurate versions would surface in later years, most notably the great port for TurboGrafx-16 and the remixed and upgraded Game Gear adaptation. And of course, Sega has done a great job of keeping the original arcade release in circulation through collections, the Astro City Mini, and even a great 3D enhanced port to Nintendo 3DS. But for its time, Fantasy Zone on Master System was an 8-bit masterpiece, and a strong statement of intent, one that cheerfully humbled anyone who wrote it off as being too cute by crushing the disbelievers with its unrelenting difficulty. Who needs a Belmont when you have a Ghost House? Here we have a game about a kid who punches swords out of the air and doesn't just fight Dracula, he fights a whole load of Draculas. Ghost House almost seems to hint at the console's future as a beloved fixture of European households. This feels remarkably like a European platformer, consisting of multi-tiered stages in which players can scroll freely and need to perform all sorts of arcane actions in order to advance. It also has slightly awkward controls, with jump and attack buttons reversed from the Super Mario Bros. Arrangement that has become the industry standard for 2D platformers, and clumsy short-ranged attacks with iffy collision detection. The game also lacks somewhat for variety, being the first US release to appear in the low-cost, low-capacity Sega card format. Despite these shortcomings, I wouldn't call Ghost House a poor game, or even a mediocre one, more like a product of its time, a decent little time killer. Honestly, if we want to keep comparing NES and Master System launch titles, Ghost House falls short of Super Mario, but feels a whole lot more modern than any other black box platformer. Stacked up next to the clumsy Ice Climber, or the excellent but elderly Donkey Kong or Mario Bros., Ghost House belongs in 1986, rather than, say, 1983. Although, according to Sega Retro, Ghost House owes its existence to a 1982 arcade game called Monster Bash, which does share a common theme and some mechanics with Ghost House. This plays almost like a rough draft for the Alex Kidd games, from the control physics and slightly frustrating punch attacks of protagonist Mick, to the overall sensation that the player needs to wrestle with unfriendly game design the whole time. Ghost House drops Mick into an infinite Taurus-like world akin to that of Flicky or Fantasy Zone, though in this case the loop comprises the interior and rooftops of a haunted mansion. The phantasmagorical element actually justifies the loop mechanic. You're trapped in a hell dimension, and you can only escape by defeating a bunch of Draculas. You need to comb the interiors of each mansion by traveling laterally through these loops, and determining where you need to climb or descend to reach different partitioned-off sections of the building. Along the way, bats spawn infinitely to harass you, ghosts and mummies wander and attempt to paralyze you, and horrible red hopping guys try to blast you with their fire breath. You can fight off these enemies with Mick's stupid little fists. The controls and collision programming make it very difficult to wade through the infinite hosts of monsters without slowly losing bits of life, or quickly losing bits of life if you get hit with that fire breath. You can grab special icons along the way that will restore some health, but these don't regenerate when you lose a life, so if you snatch them early on, you may not have enough endurance to reach some of the better hidden Draculas you need to defeat. To beat a Dracula, you first need to find a key, which will drop from a seemingly random enemy spawn. Then you take that key to one of the Dracula's sealed coffins, which will cause the vampire to rise and begin zipping around the screen far faster than Mick can deal with, slamming into our hero repeatedly to sap his health. You can only deal damage to a Dracula within the split seconds in which it manifests as a humanoid, which it won't always do within your reach. These fights are pretty unfair and feel almost hopeless, though on the plus side, a defeated Dracula drops a heart icon that will fully replenish Mick's health, and you can tilt the odds in your favor a bit by paying attention to the weird gameplay factors that pop up as you explore the mansion. At seemingly random times, arrows and swords will fly in from off-screen, striking Mick as he attempts to deal with the myriad monsters that surround him. These turn out to be less random than they first appear. The arrows only fly in when you stand or walk in front of a hearth, and swords only appear when you leap beneath a candelabra. And both can be dangerous, but they can also be beneficial. If you jump on an arrow or sword, you'll cause them to drop harmlessly to the ground. Jump on a dozen arrows throughout the course of a stage, and you'll be granted a surprisingly generous period of invincibility in which Mick begins to flash and will destroy any enemy he touches, short of a Dracula. Punch a light fixture in the ceiling, and you'll cause all enemies to freeze for a few seconds. And if you knock a sword from the air, you can pick it up and use it for a while, doubling both your attack power and your range. Using a sword makes the Dracula encounters almost reasonable, and a sword can make short work of those fire breath guys too. It's all fairly strange, a little opaque, and far from a masterpiece thanks to its iffy physics, but Ghost House has its charm. The graphics have the same cartoon-like quality as Safari Hunt. The music is what the kids today would call a bop. And the secret mechanics actually become pretty fun once you figure out what they're all about. A timeless classic? No. But it's a pretty charming little entry in the Sega Master System library that might not have worked as a full-price release, but feels just right as a budget Sega card title. And hey, look at that Sega card box art. J. Walter Thompson, your comically literal graphic design philosophy has transcended the 80s to create a truly timeless bit of kitsch. Next time on Segaiden, Sega gets arrested for choplifting.